Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and welcome to our webcast viewers. My name is Fred Mifflin, President of the Canadian Club of Toronto and your host today. Viewers, thank you for joining us on this, our final event of the season. We're proud of our club's track record of providing a forum for business, political, and cultural leaders to share their ideas with us and to challenge our thinking. Today's guest speaker is a perfect example. Event sponsors are critically important to the success of our events. So I want to express special thanks to our sponsors today who've had a very special relationship with our guest speaker over many years. Andrew Coyne, Chantal Hébert, David Hurley, Kathleen Monk, and Jamie Watt. Thank you for your generous support, both for this event as well as for participating in our events during the season. Before I formally introduce Peter Mansbridge, I want to thank you all for your ongoing support during this, our 120th season. Without your commitment, we wouldn't be able to attract such a great roster of speakers, so your attendance, input, and support are all critical to our club's continued success. Also, special thanks to our volunteer board and especially to our staff for their tireless efforts during what has been a busy season. I also want to introduce our incoming president, Gillian Riley, who you'll hear from a little later, who will be your chief event host for the upcoming season in September. Gillian, a formal congratulations as you take on your new role, and every good wish for success in the upcoming season. And now our guest speaker. He's been a fixture at CBC for almost 5 decades. Peter Mansbridge. That's a positive fixture. Peter Mansbridge, chief correspondent, anchor, host. We know him from the National, CBC News specials, and Mansbridge One-on-One. From Fort Churchill, Manitoba to Ottawa, he's been instrumental in telling stories about Canada's history, its growth, and the outlook for our future. Whether as an enterprising reporter or parliamentary correspondent, his coverage of national and world events is legendary. He's interviewed countless international leaders and enjoys the distinction of being the only Canadian journalist to have been to the White House to interview the then President Barack Obama. His impressive journalistic career has been decorated with more than a dozen national awards for excellence in broadcast journalism. Added to this, he's received numerous honorary degrees from universities across the country. His work has also been recognized by leading universities in the United States and the United Kingdom. He's an officer of the Order of Canada and a member of the Canadian News Hall of Fame. As he gets set to step down from his role as anchor of the National in a few short weeks, we welcome the opportunity to hear from him directly about his career and the country we all call home. So as I mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please complete the Q&A cards on your tables, and one of our staff will collect them, and Gillian Riley, our incoming president, will moderate that part of the program. So, Peter, congratulations on a brilliant career and a warm welcome. The Canadian Club of Toronto's podium is yours.
Thank you, Fred, very much. May I start by acknowledging that we're on the territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge that the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable John Turner, is in the room, and it's great to see you again, sir. And I'd also like to thank the sponsors of today's luncheon, my good friends at both the Insiders and At Issue. I'm not quite sure what sponsors mean. I know I didn't even get cab fare to get over here, but so where that sponsorship went, I'm not sure. Fred, I appreciate the introduction. Very kind of you. Nice things that you've said. I should let you know that it doesn't necessarily mean what you think it is when you describe someone as a fixture on the landscape. I recall giving a speech at a luncheon somewhat similar to this in Charlottetown a few years ago. I think it was the Charlottetown Board of Trade. And I'd flown in the morning, given the luncheon speech, and I had to be back in Toronto that night to do the National. And I raced out to the airport. I had a ticket on the small aircraft from Charlottetown to Halifax, and then I'd get on the big jet to Toronto. So I had the ticket. I got to the airport. They were already boarding. I went through the check-in process. I got my boarding pass, 1A. And I like this, small plane, no business class and economy, but I got the front seat because I like to get on last and get off first. And so I walk out to the tarmac. It's Charlottetown, it's all very casual, and this was before they tightened things up a bit, but I walked across the tarmac. As I got near the plane, the pilot kind of pushed back the window and went, "Hey, Peter, it's great to have you with us today. Welcome aboard." And I said, "Oh, thank you. It was very kind of you." Got on the plane, turned to 1A, and there was a guy in it, great big guy. He was probably about 6'6", weighed about 300 pounds. I thought, I'm not going to ask him to move. But I could see 2A was open right behind him. So I went and sat down. And the doors closed. The flight attendant started a little thing about how we should do our seatbelts up. And suddenly she stopped in the middle of her little spiel and clicked over. Obviously the pilot was trying to reach her, and she went, "Yes, yes," and then she hung up that phone, and she walked over to the guy in 1A, and she said, "The captain would like to know if you'd like to sit in the jump seat for the flight over to Halifax." And the guy looked at her and said, "Yeah." Nobody's ever asked me to do that before. So he got up and went towards the front, and she almost had to kind of wedge him through that area to get him into the door, but she succeeded in that and then closed the door and turned around. She could see the dozen or so people on the plane were a little wondering what was actually going on. So she picked up her microphone. She said, "That's okay. That was Peter Mansbridge." So that's what it's like to be a fixture on the landscape. As I prepare to exit the stage of the National, it's given me an opportunity to think back over a lot of the work that I've done and how it relates to the country that we share. And so there have been a lot of memories for me. I think back almost 40 years to the summer of 1979, when I was sent to Japan to cover the G7 summit of its day. And while I was there, the whole Vietnamese boat people story became a dominant headline in the world's media. And so they asked me to fly down from Tokyo to Hong Kong and to do a story on the boat people. It was a major moment in my life, and it's affected me ever since those days. Suddenly, I was out in the South China Sea talking to these people who were coming in this particular case, towards a refugee camp in Hong Kong, who had fled their homes in Vietnam. They were ethnic Chinese. They were being persecuted. They used every penny they had to buy their way out of that country on board these rickety vessels in incredibly cramped conditions, risking their lives. Some died, women were abused, children, some fell overboard. It was a terrible, hazardous ordeal. But in the case of where I was, near Hong Kong, they'd made it. But they'd made it to what? They had no idea where they were going. And the ones I talked to in the refugee camp there only had one goal in mind: find me somewhere I can take my family to give my children an opportunity for success. So we're in a refugee camp of 10,000 people in Hong Kong, 10,000 refugees. And in one small corner of that camp, there was one guy, 22 years old, sitting at a desk, kind of a makeshift desk in the open. He's a Canadian immigration officer. His name is Scott Mullen. He works in Toronto now. He's at one of the big banks downtown, major executive. Sorry? He's a navigator now? Oh, well, forget the story then. He had been at a bank, then he went to navigator. TD, that's right. Anyway, Scott was sitting there, and he was the only guy from Canada, and he was making decisions. You're in or you're out. 1 year on the job. And he had that weight on his shoulders. So I do this story. Fast forward 30 years. I give out a number of scholarships every year to young students with bright futures, and a couple of summers ago at the ceremony on one of these was a young woman from Milton, Ontario, who'd won the scholarship. And so at a dinner, she comes up on the stage, we have pictures taken. She says to me, "Do you think once the ceremony's over, we could have a picture with my parents?" And I said, "Absolutely." So her parents come up, we're standing there, and the mother leans over to me and she said, "I was a boat person in 1979, came from Vietnam. This is an incredible moment for me to see my daughter receive this scholarship." So in that moment, the story had come full circle for me, because this woman, the mother, who was a child in 79, I saw in her eyes the excitement and the pride she had for her daughter that I'd seen in those refugees' eyes coming off those boats in the South China Sea. Just give my family a chance. And they got their chance. And they got their chance in Canada. You know, there was a lot of great journalism done that summer by news organizations from around the world. And in terms of Canada, it had an impact. 60,000 refugees from Vietnam came into Canada. This family, obviously, was just one. So I think of stories like that. Here's a couple more. 2005. I'm in Sri Lanka. I'm on the shore in a little community on the eastern side of the island, just after the tsunami. And in this one community that we were in, there were hundreds that died when the waves came ashore. There were so many died that stacked the bodies in the gardens of the hospital because the morgue was full. So we're anchoring our program that night. We had correspondents in different places in Southeast Asia that have been impacted by all this. And we're anchoring our program from this one spot in Sri Lanka. And we're down on the waterfront. Everything, a mess down there, everything, lots of buildings destroyed. We're shooting what we call the links, where I stand there and link the items together. And there was a small group of young kids who gathered there to watch. And once we'd finished shooting, one of the kids had a soccer ball and was kind of tossing it around, and we were playing, kicking it back and forth. And one of the kids, a young girl, came up to me, and they couldn't speak English, but they kind of had a broken English, and she looked at me and she went, because she saw on my jacket or my bag a Canada pin. She looked at it and she said, "Canada, good." So we called the interpreter over and say, why did she say that? Well, it turned out that that morning, this little girl and her friends, the other kids, had been taken to a field hospital where they got vaccinations, they got shots, needles, for the kind of things that can spread quickly after a natural disaster in the water, because of poor sanitation and everything. And that, according to these kids, the field hospital had been run by Canadians. Well, that didn't make any sense to us because we didn't think that there were any Canadians in that immediate area. We knew of where Canadians were in other areas, the rapid deployment force of the armed forces and some of the different aid groups. But these kids were adamant, and so they told us where this tent was, and off we went to find it. And sure enough, there it was. Field hospital, a big lineup of young kids and the elderly, the two most vulnerable groups at a time like that, standing outside it. We go inside. Who's there? 3 nurses from Vancouver. They were there as volunteers. They weren't associated with anybody. They'd heard the stories at their home in Vancouver on the radio and newspapers about how awful things were in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka in particular. And they got each other on the phone. They said, "We got to go. We got to go there and help." So they took time off from their jobs. They bought tickets for their own money. They flew to Colombo, the capital of Sri Lanka. Got off the plane, go through customs, said, "We're 3 nurses from Canada. We'll go anywhere you want." That's how they ended up in that field hospital. That's how they ended up with that little girl and her friends. Make you feel pretty good to be a Canadian on that day and realize the impact that it had. How many kids do you know like needles? These kids appreciated what had been done, and they linked it directly to our country. I'm standing on the street, 1994, in a European city. It's pouring rain. The streets are lined with people waving Canadian flags. And walking through the middle of the street are veterans, hundreds of them. The city's Apeldoorn in the Netherlands. The veterans who were walking on the street had been there 50 years before, 1945, liberated Apeldoorn and some of the surrounding communities. 250,000 people are on the streets of Apeldoorn. They're there to thank Canada again, as they do every big anniversary year. So we're covering this live. One of our reporters goes up to a woman who was right at the front of the line, right on the edge of the street. She's not that old. She's holding her son, who was maybe 4. And our reporter goes up and says, "Why are you here in the pouring rain with your little 4-year-old son?" She looks right into the camera. She says, "I'm here because I want him to know what a Canadian is." And as soon as I heard her say that, I thought, that's the question I've been trying to answer my whole career. What's a Canadian? Remember all those constitutional stories. Trudeau and the Patriation, Mulroney and Beach Lake, Chrétien and the 95 referendum in Quebec. Often, those stories came down to us trying to define what a Canadian is, and we'd have panels, not to complain about panels. We'd have panels, and we'd do polls and focus groups, and it would always be around that question, who are we really? And we'd come up with, brilliant answers like, well, a Canadian's not an American. That woman in Apeldoorn, in the rain, to her, with her experience, she had no doubt what a Canadian was. Canadian was somebody who'd come from the other side of the world to be there for her and her country in their worst moment. And she was going to make sure her son knew that, just like her parents had taught her. And she hoped he would teach his kids one day. Another moment makes you feel good to be Canadian. And the last of this sort of hat trick of stories. 2006, in Kabul, just spent about a week in Kandahar. We're on our way out. Stop in Kabul to, among other things, talk to a young Canadian woman who was working in Kabul on a CETA grant to try and help Afghan women understand what their rights were under the new Afghan constitution. The rights were pretty simple. They were the same as men. That's what it said on the paper. It's a little hard to see it anywhere. But her role was to help them understand what those rights were. And it was not an easy role. It was dangerous. They had to meet in small groups, often at night, sometimes outside of the capital of Kabul. So it carried some danger. That was remarkable enough. But this young woman, her backstory was even more interesting. She'd been born in Afghanistan. She and her family had left in the early 1990s as refugees. They were on kind of the world market. Canada took them in. They went to Montreal. She went to school, finished her high school degree. They became Canadian citizens. She went to McGill, got a degree in computer sciences, could have walked into almost any job anywhere. But she said, no, first, I want to go back. I want to go back to the country I was born in to explain to them what it's like to live in a country that's free. And so she went back. So you get those three little stories, all of things that I've witnessed over time, different years in my career, all from outside Canada that offer a view of us. Get the volunteers from Vancouver. That little girl will never forget Canada, never. Whenever she sees a Canadian flag or hears the name, she'll always think of what happened when her country was in peril. You got the story of the veterans. These guys are like well into their 90s now, and they're getting smaller as a group every year, but they'll never be forgotten in the Netherlands. Do you ever find yourself in the Netherlands, just say you're Canadian, you'll be amazed at the way you're treated. And then the new Canadian, who's so in love with her new country and what it stands for that she uses us as an example when she goes back to Afghanistan of what life could be. So the message, I think we can all take our own. I tend to think that I finally got the answer to that question that's haunted me, but who we are. What is a Canadian? Simple, really. It's not that complicated. It's that we care. At a time when there's evidence that hate is spreading, even in our country, at a time when there's evidence of the inequities in our society are increasing, even in our country, there's also evidence that the overwhelming majority of Canadians care about their neighbors, whether those neighbors are across the street or across the country or across the world. And that is something to be proud of on any day, and especially as we approach this marker in the history of a great nation. Let me leave you with just one last anecdote. You know, when you come to the end of one career, and apparently, according to Fred, that's what I'm coming to, you do flip back and think of where you've been, what you've done, what you've accomplished. And as a journalist, there are lots of ways to make that measurement. And one of them is to wonder, because we don't all get to do this, is just how many places you've actually been to and talked about and reported on where the world changed, where something happened that we'll be talking about for decades, if not centuries. I was lucky. I was in Berlin the weekend the wall came down. Wasn't there the first night. I was in Ottawa covering a constitutional conference. But I got there by the weekend. It had started on a Thursday night. And I was there, and it was remarkable, the story. None of us were convinced we knew exactly what was happening. We knew the world was changing. But there I was, broadcasting from the wall with the Brandenburg Gate behind me, looking into a camera like that one, talking back to Canada, and beside me was the NBC location where Tom Brokaw was, doing the same thing. And the other side of me, I think, was Japanese television. But as far as you could look either way, there were journalists, reporters, television people from all over the world. It was like McLuhan's Global Village, suddenly caught in that moment. We were all telling the same story to the world. So that was big. Being in Rome for the funeral of John Paul was big for a lot of the world. Whether you believed in his religion or believed in some of the things that he had done, people recognized that this was a world figure. And so the world came for the final days. So we're there, we're getting ready to do the broadcast the next morning, and we're having kind of a meeting in our hotel area of all our staff, and there's a knock at the door. I open the door, and there's a priest standing there, and he says, "I'm Father so-and-so, I'm working with the Vatican, and I'm here to offer you any assistance that you might want, agendas, itineraries, the order of service, all of that, interviews, we can help you with all of that." And we said, "That's great, that's wonderful," and he gave us his card. And before he left, he looked at his chart and he said, "Is there a Peter Mansbridge here?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm Peter Mansbridge." And he says, "We're wondering if you'd like to come over to the Vatican. We're offering this to all the presenters, anchors from around the world, to pay your last respects to John Paul, who was lying in state at St. Peter's." So, what are you going to say? No? So I said absolutely, and some of us walked over with him, went in through a back door at the Vatican. And those of you who've been in St. Peter's know there's that area, the kind of rotunda area, and that's where John Paul was laid out, and there was a lineup that was lasting 6-7 hours for the public to come in, and we went through a back way, so we had the kind of VIP lineup. And so we're standing there, and I said, what actually is the way to proceed here? And he said, "Just walk between these purple ropes right up to where John Paul is, and 30, 40 seconds, and then turn around and come back." And so I said, "Okay." Off we went. I did it. I stood there, I bowed my head, I thought about this man's remarkable life. I thought about his visits to Canada, all of which I'd covered. I thought about having met him, both in Canada and in Rome. And then I turned around and walked back. Thanked the priest, walked back to where we were all gathered, and a couple of the fellows who were setting up the equipment said, "Oh, you were great, that was terrific." And we said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "Well, it was all on television. You should watch it. You won't forget it. So we rewound the tape, started it up, and it was CNN International. They were based in London, and they were doing, talking about some other story, when one of the two, there were two anchors there, and one of the two said, "Just a minute, we have to go to Rome. A very important person has arrived to pay their last respects to John Paul." And I'm going, this can't be happening. They cut to the pictures inside St. Peter's as the wide shot from the pool cameras that the Vatican controlled of the scene inside the rotunda area. And then slowly starts to zoom in, and there's a close-up there. In the foreground is John Paul's body, and in the background there's us, kind of with me in the center of the shot. And the other anchor says, "Yes, there he is, the President of Poland." Another moment of the fixture on the landscape. Thank you very much.
So, is it on? Can you hear me? Yep, good. We have time for a few questions.
Okay.
My name is Jillian Riley, and I'm the president-elect of the Canadian Club. And I have a few questions that have been given to me from the audience. So I don't know if we'll have time for all of them. I think we have time for a few. The first one says, Peter, what are your own media consumption habits? TV, radio, digital, time of day?
All of the above, actually, but the time of day, I'm a big consumer in the morning. I mean, traditionally our first meeting of the morning is around 9 o'clock, where the senior editors talk about the stories we're going to cover, and if you're going to be ready for that meeting, you've got to know what's going on. So I'm up early, and I read through the luxury mainly of Twitter, access to some of the great papers and journals of the world. I watch a number of different television shows in the morning, and I read a lot online, and I listen to some radio, mainly when I'm in the car, which is quite a bit of time when you consider that our main home is in Stratford, so there's a lot of driving back and forth. So I've always believed that, and I tell our viewers that you've got to, if you want to be truly informed, you can't just rely on television. It's not going to get you there. Even a major newscast, a network newscast, as Cronkite used to say, there's not a lot there. It's kind of the headlines. If you want to really know about something, you've got to go deeper. You've got to read, especially read. And to back that up, when you think of a half-hour newscast, which is more like about 20 or 22 minutes once you take the commercials out, if you took a transcript of that, you probably couldn't fill the front page of Andrew's paper. Well, maybe you could with Andrew's paper. No, I'm serious. There's the power of television and the power of the image, and we all know what every photograph is worth in the terms of words. But still, if you want to be informed, you've got to go beyond. You've got to go beyond television.
Okay, here's a bit more of a serious question. As an experienced journalist, where do you see the future of journalism in Canada going? And there's a second part. What can young journalists like myself do to ensure a bright future?
I always used to, believe that I knew what was going to be a year or 5 years down the road in journalism. Quite frankly, I don't anymore, because things are changing so fast. The way our audience consumes news, the different vehicles they choose and platforms they choose to consume it change is happening so quickly. I mean, we're in the process of redeveloping this program. I announced a year ago that I was leaving, which we thought was great because it would give them a year to get organized. And they're already into the sixth draft of what it's going to look like because things keep changing. I'm just joking there. They're not. But the fact is they have to stay on top of a changing marketplace. And so that's a challenge. But the other question, look, I mean, we just further to his question about where things are going. We live in a world where the youth of today have the ability to be better informed than any other group of young people before in the history of this planet. You know, it's a matter of ensuring you choose those methods and those news organizations and those sources that are trustworthy. And that's a challenge with the internet. It's a sewer in places. But there is a lot of information there. So, you know, there's reason to be optimistic, too, about the future. But in terms of young people, my advice has been the same for a long time. You know, think big, be ambitious. You know, want my job, want Andrew's job, want the best jobs out there. But be prepared to start small. You know, some of the best journalists I know have not spent all their time in Toronto. They've worked in different parts of the country, small communities, large cities. They have a sense of Canada. You can't get it by living inside the 401 in downtown Toronto. You have to get out. You have to explore our country and understand it. And you'll also get an opportunity to you know, do a lot more things within journalism, a lot more jobs than just focusing on one area.
I think that's great advice. So we're time for one last question. This was kind of the one I actually had, but someone's written it here. Who's the most interesting person that you interviewed in your career and why?
Well, you know, I've done about 15,000 interviews, so
picking one is difficult.
yeah, you know, it really is. And to me, there are two kind of camps. There are the famous, the well-known, the celebrity type interviews, whether they be political or sports or entertainment, and those are fun. You know, there's no question about that, and some of them are interesting when you get them off there. Well, I say that with respect because so many of them have been interviewed so many times that it's hard to, you know, break through that wall of message track with a lot of people. JNT, as we affectionately call the former Prime Minister, former Finance Minister, was one of those who we actually sat down with and did an interview. You never knew what you were going to get. You know, he was pretty honest with you. But beyond that type, it's the others, the people who whose names you probably will never remember, but who have fascinating stories to tell. You know, we talk about the ordinary people with extraordinary stories. They could be those boat people coming off the little vessels in Southeast Asia. They could be the people who have been hit by the tsunami. They could be people in drought-stricken areas of Africa. They could be the poor and disadvantaged in our own communities. They could be, you know, stories of Indigenous peoples in our land who feel they have been forgotten. Those stories, when you sit down and talk to these people, impact you in all kinds of ways, not just as a journalist, but as a person. And you don't feel that you're being spun, that you actually are hearing a real story from real people. And those will always be the most important ones.
Okay, there's one here I have to ask from your friends. They actually asked me for this one, so I have to go with one more question.
I have friends here?
You have your sponsors.
Oh, my sponsors.
So this is the last one. It's a good one, I think.
Okay.
Who do you really like better, the insiders or the at-issue panel?
It's actually the bottom line panel. We're all, yeah. We are all better informed for what almost, what was it, 16 years of at issue, mainly with Andrew and Chantal. We're all better informed because of them, and we have a better understanding of what really happens with the politicians of our land and how they make decisions and who helps them make decisions because of the insiders. So I think they're both of equal value.
Good answer. Good answer. I think I'm going to do the thank you, and then I'll tell you about that. Well, I don't know about you, but that was a great presentation. On behalf of the Canadian Club of Toronto, thank you for captivating us in your distinct style with the special stories that make Canada a shining example in the world community. I particularly liked how you said Canadians care, and you made it simple. They care about their neighbours, they care everywhere that you've been, and the stories that you made it real for us. For more than 50 years, Canadians have come to rely on your coverage of some of the most important events of our time. Whether it was 14 federal elections or hosting 8 Olympic ceremonies, you have helped document our history in important and symbolic ways. And I liked how you answered the question about it was the ones that we don't know about, the ones that make it real, the things that you learned. We are impressed and inspired by the 15,000 interviews you've conducted with leaders and personalities of every persuasion. And while we have bittersweet feelings about your impending departure as anchor of the National, your impact will continue to be felt. I hope they find an anchor soon. Please accept our deepest gratitude for all that you have done for the journalism industry and for our beloved country. In honor of Canada's 150th birthday and Peter Mansbridge's retirement, we have a celebratory cake that could feed 500 people over in the corner, so I hope in a few minutes we're going to cut the cake and that you'll have a piece of our cake. I would also like to thank Fred Mifflin, who is our outgoing president of the Canadian Club. Your leadership, your positive influence, and your stewardship of the Canadian Club for the past year has been outstanding. Thank you, Fred, for your year. Before we conclude, let me extend another round of thanks to today's sponsors, Andrew Coyne, Chantal Hébert, David Hurley, Kathleen Monk, and Jamie Watt. We would also like to thank MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, and VVC for live streaming today's event. To learn more about our club, please visit us at canadianclub.org. You can also join the conversation via Twitter and Instagram by following us at CDNCLUBTO or by using that hashtag. Our annual subscription are available as of tomorrow for the upcoming season. Thank you again to Peter for your delightful speech today. Thank you for joining us, and please enjoy some cake, so don't all rush out, and we'll look forward to seeing you in our next season, the 121st season starting in September. Thank you.